Welcome to the Grow Senior Care Podcast. Forget about being average. We're here to redefine what's possible in both your business and your life. Get fired up because we're here to help you simplify your life, grow your business with less hassle, and love what you do. Now, here's your host, Jeremy Fuller from Grow Senior Care Marketing.
Hey, this is Jeremy with Grow Senior Care Marketing, and I'm so excited today for our guest on our podcast, David, with ZenGage. And what we're going to be talking about is super impactful to really bring some insight to how you guys are managing your caregivers, and if you're managing them in a way that actually will grow and sustain your company and make your company thrive through how you're creating your culture and treating your caregivers and rewarding your caregivers, or you create an atmosphere that's toxic, that doesn't really reward your team and doesn't really recognize their value. So we're going to be talking about how to do that with your home care agency. I would probably say this is probably one of the most difficult things. I don't know about you, David, but I feel like, just having a team here at our marketing agency, knowing how to really talk to individuals on their level, on how they sense things, is not the easiest thing to do in the world, right? You've got to be really flexible and maneuverable on how you approach situations, and every situation is a little bit different in how you handle it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of this, how to build a team that can grow and thrive and not crash, right? So I'll hand this off to you, but Dave, why don't you just do a quick intro, who you are, who you're with, and some of the problems that ZenGage solves.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. My name's David Knack. I head up sales for a company called ZenGage, and we do caregiver engagement with home care agencies. It's lonely out there in the field as a caregiver. I think some of the biggest challenges that exist on the individual level are things like, the only time I hear from the office is when I've screwed something up or when they need a favor. And, I've heard of caregivers who are really consistent, who are great employees, but who don't want to pick up the phone when you call because they know that you're going to get asked to go and pick up a shift and it's going to be this whole thing. And so there's a lack of connectedness in home care. One of the things that if you look at an employee morale survey, I have a best friend at work, yes or no, or agree or disagree, is really important to feeling at home in a workplace. Knowing that if I do great work, I'll get recognized is really important in a home care agency or in any job.
Any company.
And both of those things I think are the hardest to hit within home care. It's lonely out there in the field. You often only hear about the bad stuff that's going on. You don't get any of those non-work related touches because there's no water cooler in home care. And so we saw this problem within home care, which rears its ugly head as we talk about retention issues and turnover, but also as it relates to like performance issues around, people are not clocking in and out in WellSky or Access Care or whatever the system is that you're using. There's no call, no shows or last minute call outs that are super stressful to fill in. There's folks who call in after hours and ask to get clocked in. And that's, really inefficient. It's frustrating. It interrupts people's dinners and date nights and those kinds of things. And so we built a system that does employee engagement, that helps agencies build culture. And a lot of the starting point is around recognizing that consistent performance instead of just the heroes who swoop in at the last minute and save the day. Really acknowledging those folks who are consistent performers who may never pick up an extra shift, but you never have to worry about whether or not they're going to show up. And we're able to handle all this automatically. I know a lot of people do like a crazy pivot table in Excel to try and figure out who their best caregivers are and who should get caregiver of the month. And that's a really great idea. But the execution of that is super challenging.
Yeah. And you make a great point on the spreadsheets. I love and hate spreadsheets. And I'll tell you why. Every time you get a new team member, they're going to have their own way that they work with a spreadsheet. And so spreadsheets can be beneficial for like short-term projects that I find, but if you're trying to run your business on it, everybody's going to have their own little spin, and then you can just easily delete a cell or a table. And it's just like, oh gosh, well now all that data is gone. And what is this process? You walk in as an owner and it's completely different the next day. Well, because Sally wanted to do something different with the spreadsheet.
Exactly.
So, that's interesting that I see that, and I talk to home care agency owners and they talk about, oh, I've got this spreadsheet. I'm like, it's like the worst way to do something. It can work, but is probably the worst way to do it.
And
Okay,
it's a lot of people's version 1, right? Like it's a great place to start, but if that's where you run your business, you're probably going to run into some trouble.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about company culture. You brought up kind of the problem that the software that ZenGage solves, and you said you've been focusing on culture and talking about that with home care agencies. Kind of talk a little bit about culture and how that might affect performance issues.
Yeah. I think taking a little bit of a step back, like the idea of culture, I think can feel a little smushy and a little fluffy. And it's like, well, what's the ROI on great company culture? And I think anybody who has excellent company culture and maybe has seen that kind of, as they've grown and scaled, has seen that kind of fall by the wayside a little bit, I think knows the impact that culture can have on the organization. But I think, fundamentally, this idea of company culture, when people have buy-in to the mission of what you're doing, because gosh, frontline work, which is what home care falls under, fast food, gig work like Uber Eats and Amazon fulfillment centers and all this kind of stuff. There is so much competition for the frontline talent pool. And there are organizations like Taco Bell who will pay for your school. There's places like Chick-fil-A that are starting folks at $20, $22 an hour. It's not feasible for home care agencies to compete on the kind of perks and incentives and dollar amounts that people can make. We can't compete on the flexibility of work of like an Uber Eats or whatever. And so the reality is, culture has to be our differentiator in home care. We're creating great work that's meaningful and that you are making a difference in people's lives.
That's such a great point.
And the good news is there's a lot of people who want that.
Yeah.
The bad news is it's really hard to make people feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves when they're out there on their own in the field. And sometimes the client placement is really challenging and difficult. And there's, some behavior issues because of cognitive impairment, all that kind of stuff. And so keeping the main thing, we are taking care of people in a really vulnerable part of their life. And what we're doing together means something is really hard to continue to communicate and message to people and create an identity and a culture around in a place with no water cooler and in a place where people don't get together in person.
That's really good. Yeah. So some people may not know this, but my wife was a CNA. And I don't think that she still, I think she let that license go. But after like our second kid, it was like just too hard for, she like, I can't really do this, but she really wanted to because that was her passion, like you're talking about. You can't really compete. So it doesn't come down to what do I make an hour, because you're not going to be able to compete like that, like you said. And it doesn't come down to, time flexibility because you've got Uber Eats and all this other stuff. They can just work whenever they want. So what does it come down to then? Like you said, passion, making a difference. My wife, she had a client that she worked with, and she was just so passionate about making sure that he was taken care of. He almost became like a second grandpa to her. Yeah. She just loved taking care of seniors, and it made her day that she was making a senior day. And so for her, she was just very passionate about it. And some of the agencies that she would work with, you could just tell, like you said, they didn't really care that much. It was more of like, hey, can you just make the shift? It was another number, another position, another seat to fill type thing.
Yeah.
And how they treated her, sometimes she would call me on the phone. This was before we got married. We were dating at this time, and she would just cry. And she would just say, the office is making me feel terrible. I feel like I'm not even valuable. Just how they talked to me. And so I think there needs to be a culture shift in some companies. And I've even been around some owners. I'm not going to say who or anything. I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, but they would just, we would be in a car, driving somewhere, and they would just be complaining about their staff. And I'm just like, well, one, you shouldn't be in that position to feel that way as an owner, but two, what are you doing in your company to make a change? Or are we just complaining here? I didn't say that, this is going in on my head because I'm driving in a car with these people. And, but I realize there's a huge disconnect from the owners and the team, and the team doesn't feel appreciated. The owners don't feel like they're doing what they need to do. And there's just a mismatch.
Yeah. Well, and I think being a scheduler, a recruiter, an HR manager, those roles within a home care agency are really challenging. And you're stretched thin between important strategic priorities, the metrics that you're going to be, your success is going to be measured on, and the fact that you need to send 20 text messages to the caregivers that you can see in your scheduling system haven't clocked in yet. And so the kind of whiplash between important strategic work that moves the business forward, but is not as urgent as if we don't get these clock ins done, billing's going to be a nightmare. That kind of whiplash, I think, makes it really hard to feel like you're doing a good job in home care. And, one of the reasons that I think companies have had so much success with our software is that we're able to create great habits with caregivers as it relates to timeliness and attendance and mobile clock-in rates and completion of documentation. And what that frees the staff up to do is to do the work that only people can do, of connecting with caregivers, connecting with clients. And I think, every owner just about that I talk to has a personal, very meaningful story of the reason that they got into home care in the first place. But as you scale beyond, 500 hours or 1,000 hours a week in care, you get above 60, 70, 80 caregivers, you don't have the kind of one-to-one, person-to-person level of connection that you did when you had 5 clients and 12 caregivers, when you knew everybody's grandkids' names and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a great point. So how does home care agencies that are larger and that are growing, let's say they're on their way to growing. So let's say they're going from, say, 50 caregivers to 100. They're on their way, right?
Yeah.
Many times I always tell people, we don't know what we don't know, right? Yeah. So you haven't had 100 caregivers before, but you're on your way. So how do you create these SOPs that you may not know to create? Obviously we can go to ChatGPT these days, but, even then you can't really validate, okay, well, that's correct. Or, that methodology is the right way to go for me. So how do you make caregivers feel valued, seen, recognized? Do you guys have some strategies or recommendations that you have on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question and kind of gets at the core of what we seek to do when we're working with our clients is, I think within, let's say you've got 50 caregivers, that is not a monolithic group of people who all have the exact same story and are at the exact same stage in their life cycle with your business. You got folks who are in their first 30 days and are trying to figure out if this is a right fit for them or if they need to go find another job. You've got folks who are in that process and have some gaps in their training. They don't know how to check their schedule. They don't know how to get into the payroll system to check on their paycheck. All of those things cause unnecessary friction. We can get outside of those. You may have folks that are never going anywhere, that have been there for 3 or 4 years and are super consistent. Well, the kinds of things you want to work on with them are going to be very different from your person who's been there, 4 months and still can't seem to clock in and out on time. And so segmentation, I think, is something that's really important. Just like when you had 12 caregivers, you knew how to talk to each one of those caregivers in particular. Think of it now in terms of groups. You've got your folks who've been here, 0 to 90 days. You've got your folks who've been here between 90 days and 180 days, 6 months to a year. But also think in terms of performance. Who has been consistent as it relates to timeliness? Who's been inconsistent as it relates to attendance? Being able to segment on those kinds of performance metrics are all things that our product's able to do just with some quick AI prompts. So I think segmentation is super important. And then as we've worked with a couple of hundred clients over the past 2 years or so, we've figured out pretty well what works and what doesn't. And so, as part of the setup process, we do initial kind of client intake through a form. We run that through our backend algorithm of what are the kinds of things that we need to implement here, and then make some recommendations that our clients can adopt. And so the best practices are built in. It's not like a choose your own adventure thing where you're trying to figure out how many points a clock in should be worth. We're there to kind of guide our folks through the process.
Awesome. So you can really see how to bring value to the people at the certain stage that they're at. So if they're having trouble clocking in on time, it might be beneficial to let them know, hey, this is where you go to do that. Because maybe they're trying to find a link and maybe they haven't bookmarked it, or whatever your process is for your home care agency. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's not that they don't care to do it on time, or maybe it's a technical thing. And so for everybody, it might be a little bit different. But for those veterans, they should already have that down because they're doing it consistently, and you can see that data. So that makes sense. To putting them into buckets makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things that we've seen have a big impact on this is the ability to send those kind of messages to the right people at the right time. And so maybe at the 7-day mark, we send out a quick video that is, hey, you're probably already done this a couple of times, but if you're having any trouble when you get to your shift, here's the process, and let me show you how to clock in, just as a quick reminder.
Yeah.
And so being able to have that kind of timely message go to the right people would be perfect.
Yeah, that's really good. And some people might say, "Oh, I don't need to do that. They know how to do it. We've already shown them that." Well, you'd be surprised what people forget, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think stuff like that is super impactful. Having the right information at the right time is super awesome. So, let's see here. I had on my questions. So you were talking about building systems and a process to level up caregivers.
Yeah.
So how would you do that? So we've talked about making caregivers feel valued, seen, recognized. How would you kind of structure an SOP? Let's say they didn't have your software.
Sure.
Right. So we could talk about your software, what it does, but how could they do that on a spreadsheet? Could they do it on paper? Like, how would you build some systems and processes to start leveling up your caregivers?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think the short answer is you can do this with or without our software, and we've seen some folks have success for a period of time doing this in spreadsheets and manually pulling some of the data. And if it works there, it's going to work a lot easier within our platform. And so I think the question is like, where is this person today? What are the kinds of things that they're succeeding in? What are the kinds of areas that they're struggling in? And so really a classic example of this is like the last minute call out. We've got folks who are find a reason to not go to work. It may be a legitimate reason, childcare, illness, tires flat, whatever. Those happen all the time. And that's going to be a part of the business. But then you also, I had somebody use the terminology, and it's tax time of the W-2 flu. And there's seasonality to some of our caregivers and the relationship that they have with work. And there's a lot of social factors that push some people to have a different relationship to work than like you or I might have. And so one of the things that we know to be effective and that platforms like Snapchat and Duolingo leverage really well is the streak. You don't want to break your streak. People pay money to keep their Snapchat streak alive if they forget to message one of their friends on a day-to-day basis. And so creating not just like a one-time a month kind of award for a caregiver who got picked, maybe arbitrarily as caregiver of the month, instead tracking how many times somebody showed up in a row, and every 5 or 8 or 10 times in a row, having some kind of small but meaningful check-in bonus message saying, hey, notice that you passed XYZ streak. Great work. Keep it up. You put, a couple extra bucks on their payroll or whatever. And those kinds of streaks make a really big difference. If you have the capacity and the bandwidth, layering every single time this happens, you get a point or two or, a penny or two. And then at each of these milestones, you get more like $1 or $1.50. That goes a long way too. This kind of compounding impact of individual granular rewards and stacking on top of that, these streak-based rewards. You can imagine awesome. It gets kind of unwieldy pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It definitely doesn't scale. It definitely requires a lot of human intervention to make sure it keeps going. But a lot of our best customers are coming from the pivot table into our system to be able to automate the kinds of things they've been doing manually.
So a lot of people are trying to do some of this stuff in spreadsheets or stuff like that.
Totally.
And it is possible. So if you're watching and you are in a spreadsheet, sounds like maybe they need to reach out to you. But if you're just growing and starting to get started, if you're not looking for software, it sounds like it's doable to maybe get started there. Like I said earlier, it's probably wouldn't be my necessarily recommendation. I hate spreadsheets, but something to put into place. So if we're trying to level up our caregivers, rewarding them, it sounds like, is the process that you kind of follow on that. The people that are consistent, the people that are showing up, not just picking like a caregiver of the month, but going after each individual person on their individual strengths, tracking that.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And then I think, kind of taking a step back, every organization has values. There's a guy in the industry who I really look up to, and I think a lot of other people do too. His name's Stephen Tweed. And one of the things that he says is what gets measured gets managed, what gets rewarded gets repeated. And so if you've got those core values as an organization, you want to make sure that you are shouting those things out, that you're rewarding them, that you're shining a light on them when they happen, and that you're also understanding when those things aren't happening, what are the contributing factors that's preventing someone from being successful? Has their childcare situation changed and they're late because they've got to drop the kid off at school or whatever? Yeah. And so that kind of feedback loop with your caregivers, one, helps you to understand what those obstacles are and get some of that structural stuff out of the way, but also check in with them and make sure that they know that they are seen and that you care about them and that you're not just, not checking in because you have forgotten that you work with them.
Yeah. This conversation, not everybody that's going to be listening is going to be a believer. That's okay. I'm a believer. I believe in God, and I don't necessarily try to, hey, you got to believe in God like me. That's not the thing. It's just there's things that resonate with me from my belief system, such as like there's a lot of people that whenever they need something, they might go to God like, God, I need this. Lord, help me. Right. But do you pray outside that? Like, do you contact God when you don't need something just because you love them? Right. So it's kind of like, hey, it sounds like what you're suggesting is that you reach out to caregivers, not just when you need them, but to reward them, to check in on them, give them tools, give them resources so that they're not just on the front line on the battlefield, so to speak, by themselves.
Sure.
Right. That's kind of what I'm getting from the suggestions here.
Yeah, this is, fundamentally it's the question of how do you scale relationships to, instead of feeling connected to 10 or 12 caregivers, how do you create a similar way to be pretty connected to 120 caregivers? And as you scale, it's not something you can just throw a bunch of people at that problem, because the complexity of 120 caregivers is going to far outweigh the amount of administrative budget you have to throw at that. And so the question is, how can we scale this, and how can we communicate the right message to the right person at the right time, even if it's not something that I wrote specifically for you, Jeremy, but I wrote it for you and the other 15 or 20 people who are a lot like you based on what we know about you.
Because you're in a segment group, so to speak, and you hit this milestone in a spreadsheet or software or whatever. Got it. Sounds good. So, you talked a little bit ago about a reward system, connected to some of those things, those triggers, it sounds like. So having systems in place that trigger off of milestone or achievements. And those triggers could be reminders. Those triggers could be rewards. So let's talk about rewards, the pros and the cons of rewards. Because if at the end of the day, we can't compete with the Costco's, with the Chick-fil-A's, et cetera, or, the Ubers, et cetera, then how are we bringing in this? What are the pros and cons to the reward financially then? If that's not something that we can compete on.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So there's this saying, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I think a lot of times there are some individual, like single solution products that are only focused at efficiently sending gift cards to people. And that's a big step forward, right? Like, I know there are people who stand in line at Walmart with a pile of gift cards in their hand, and then they've got to put stamps on those to get those to their employees, or drive around town and drop them off. So having a way to digitally send like gift cards out to people is way better than not having that. That being said, if there is a rewards program and it's one size fits all, so it's not segmented by employee type and the kinds of things that they need to do to be successful, and if the only function of that is like a reward system of points when you do the right kinds of things, what we've found is that you have to really overspend on the rewards to be able to continue to get the bang for your buck. And so my concern long-term is, if all we have is a rewards platform, we're just going to create this de facto pay increase where all of a sudden all of your employees now earn $16 an hour plus an extra $5 or $10 a month, or an extra $20 a month, or whatever. And then what are we going to have to layer on top of that? And so I think the risk of a rewards program only is that people get accustomed to that's just part of their compensation, and they expect it, and it kind of creates some entitlement around it. Whereas what we found is that by layering on the kind of announcement capabilities, the ability to do video messaging, the feedback mechanisms of surveys, having very targeted goals, milestones, messaging, around who these employees are and where are they in their journey helps us to get a lot more efficient with our reward spend. And that becomes one piece of an overall employee experience instead of, hey, we know that this job's hard and stuff, so here's like 5 or 10 extra bucks.
Yeah.
That may sound like it's not the biggest difference in the world, but what we've seen is that by having 6 or 8 different types of value that we're delivering to employees as a part of that experience, that we're able to stay out of the pitfall of, all right, cool, this is just how much money I make now, and I expect this.
Right. Right. And of course, you have the old school frame of mind. I'm sure some of you are listening like, well, if you're paying them because they're clocking in and they consistently clock in, aren't they supposed to be doing that type of stuff anyway? So aren't you paying them on top of paying them for the same role, right? So there's people asking that question. What do you think about that?
I think this is a very like legitimate concern, right? And I think there's a lot of kind of like cultural undercurrents here of, we've got this kind of next generation that is, soft and entitled, and they expect participation trophies and all those kinds of things. I think my first comment to that is, if all of your employees showed up when they were scheduled and clocked in and out, home care would be really easy to run. Like it would be, you'd never have to stress about, if there was a referral that came in, could we staff it? Like that would help a lot. But I think the other thing, and this has honestly changed my thinking about this a lot, is even though this money is going to your caregivers at the end of the day, this is ultimately an investment in your frontline managers who make the business run. This is an investment in schedulers and recruiters and HR managers and operations directors. So I'll share just a couple of quick stories that I've heard from customers of ours. The first is we had a customer who said, we had this alarm that triggered every time there was a call out in our system, because it's like an all hands on deck kind of thing. We got to make sure we keep that revenue. We got to get that shift restaffed. We've got a client that has been expecting us, that's depending on us. We've got to get a caregiver to that shift. And they said to us, we thought our like alarm broke because it hadn't gone off in a while. And ultimately you guys had solved for our attendance problems. And so, you think about the ripple effects of a last minute call out and how much easier the business is to run if you're having, like 25% of those that you were previously. The second one, I was chatting with a customer of ours, and he said, before we started working with you guys, like 60% of our caregivers were clocking in and out themselves. And a lot of those calls were coming in after hours and were really stressful, because every time the phone rings and it's an on-call situation, you think about the worst, right? Somebody's fallen, somebody's going to the hospital. It's going to ruin my whole night. And it's going to be like a really like sad, difficult, hard thing to deal with. And instead, it was just a stinking caregiver, right? This is what you're thinking in the moment, who couldn't clock themselves in and needed me to do it instead. And so that just creates so much friction between the frontline managers and the caregivers. And what are you going to say? Are you going to say, no, I'm not going to clock you in? Like, yeah, you're going to clock them in, because to do the alternative is like so like socially unacceptable to be like, no, you have to do this yourself. I'm putting my foot down. Like, you're just not going to do that. And so what they found was that by
there's some that will do that, and that's where a lot of the problems come from.
Yeah. You can either pick to get that person to clock themselves in and out, and then they leave the next week or whatever. It just is ripe for creating a ton of friction and conflict, and it's so rough. And so what they found was that by being able to say, well, no, Jeremy, I'm not going to clock you in because I don't want you to miss out on your points. It would give a reason for you to change your pattern of behavior and build a new habit, and have a benefit to you that freed them up from having to be the bad guy who said, no, I'm not going to clock you in because the policy. And instead to be able to say, hey, I can clock you in, but I don't want you to miss out on your points. Do you want to clock yourself in? And people made the decision to change their behavior. And so, the on-call after hours burden was pretty significantly diminished. They had like 98% of their caregivers clocking themselves in and out, made everybody's life a lot better. And so fundamentally, yes, invest in your caregivers because you want great performance. You want, 100 of the best caregivers that are out there instead of 100 caregivers who may or may not show up. But more importantly, you want to make sure that your office staff are taken care of and know that they have the supports they need to be successful in their job, in marketing for referrals, in recruiting, in checking in with caregivers and doing the little birthday and anniversary touch points that we know keep people around because you remembered them and knew something about them.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Well, I really do appreciate you being on our show today, David. I think there's a lot of insight here, a lot of tips and tricks. And if somebody was to take just one of those things out, I believe they can bring in some value. So thank you for sharing some of those insights. If you want to get in touch with David or their team, what's the best way, David, that they could do that? Let's say you're listening, they want to reach out to you. I know ZenGage.com, right?
Yeah, ZenGage.com.
Sorry, not ZenGage, ZenGage, sorry.
Yeah.
ZenGage.com. And then how do you spell that if they're listening to this?
Yeah, it's ZINGAGE.
Awesome. And then, of course, you follow David on social media. You're on LinkedIn. Are you on Facebook as well?
I am not really on Facebook much anymore.
Okay. So you're like, bye, Facebook. I'm out of here.
That's it. I sailed off into the sunset.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you for being on here. And then if you're watching and listening to this, of course, my name's Jeremy and I'm with Grow Senior Care Marketing. If you're looking to really take your home care agency to the next level, if you're having issues showing up online, you got Google visibility issues, you're not really sure if you're getting return on investment from Google ads, your online leads are down. If you're facing those types of problems, reach out to us. We have something called the Ultimate Home Care Marketing Session. We would love to audit your online visibility, see where you guys stand. And so if you're looking at scheduling something like that, you can go to our website, growseniorcaremarketing.com. Love to do that audit for you and your team and check out where you're showing up online. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for listening and have a blessed day, everybody.